This episode contains discussions of First Nation forced relocation and ethnic cleansing, and the murder of both adults and children. If these aren't topics you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. The early 1800s were a time of both hope and upheaval in America. America was changing from a new and struggling nation into an international political power. The U.S. government and most of its citizens at the time had their hearts set on national expansion. It was the era of manifest destiny, the belief that it was the God-given right of the American people to settle North America from coast to coast. More immigrants were arriving from Ireland, Germany, and England, crowding into the cities of the East Coast. A terrible epidemic of cholera hit due to a combination of crowding and lack of sanitation. Because of this, many people wanted to move westward, away from the crowds, into what was known as unorganized territory, which was occupied by the indigenous peoples of North America. Indigenous tribes, at the time referred to as Indians, were either ignored completely or thought of as savage, uncivilized people by white Americans. The majority of people thought that adopting European cultural values and Christianity would benefit the indigenous peoples. Others just wanted them removed so that they could settle in those territories. Between the 1830 Indian Removal Act and 1850, the U.S. government used forced treaties and/or U.S. Army actions to move about 100,000 indigenous people, including members of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, to a designated area they called Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The First Nation peoples of the eastern United States were marched to the territory during the winter along what is now known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from disease before reaching their destination or shortly after. Violence also caused many deaths as the indigenous peoples resisted removal from their ancestral homes. A variety of scholars have classified the Trail of Tears as an example of ethnic cleansing. One of the most violent areas in the 1850s was the Kansas Territory. It was a battleground, both between settlers and indigenous peoples, and between anti-slavery advocates and pro-slavery settlers. A series of violent civil confrontations broke out in the Kansas Territory between 1854 and 1859. This was called Bleeding Kansas and was due to heated debates over the legality of slavery in the proposed state of Kansas. Electoral fraud, raids, assaults, and murders carried out by both sides occurred, resulting in 56 documented political killings. Bleeding Kansas is often called the tragic prelude to the American Civil War, which immediately followed it in the spring of 1861. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the U.S. government continued to relocate First Nation peoples. The Osage people were forced out of Kansas, making the lands southwest of Labette County available for white homesteading. This area was a dry, wind-swept plain. New settlers found themselves struggling to survive, working hard to glean even a little food and shelter. On top of this, violence persisted as ex-soldiers, scarred by the war, moved through the landscape. Travelers and settlers had to be wary of highwaymen, swindlers, and Osage attacks. Due to the constant fight for survival, most people had no energy for anything outside their own struggles. This is why few took notice when several lone travelers went missing along the Osage Trail, the main thoroughfare between Independence and Fort Scott. Mail deliveries were inconsistent and infrequent at the time, so information rarely traveled far or quickly. In May of 1871, the body of a man named Jones was discovered in Drum Creek. His throat was cut and his skull was crushed. In February of 1872, the bodies of 2 men were found with the same injuries as Jones in the same area. By 1873, reports of missing people who had passed through the area had become so common that travelers began to avoid the trail. In the winter of 1872, George Newton Longcore, or perhaps Launcher, left Independence, Kansas with his daughter Mary Ann to resettle in Iowa. They were never seen again. In the spring of 1873, Launcher's former neighbor, widely known physician Dr. William Henry York, went looking for them, questioning homesteaders along the trail. York reached Fort Scott and, having found nothing, began the return journey to Independence on March 9th. He never arrived home. In the late spring of 1873, reports of disappearances in southeast Kansas were causing concern. The Osage Township called a meeting to see what should be done. About 75 people from the surrounding areas attended. Residents were angered by the insinuations from the neighboring communities that Osage Township was responsible for the disappearances. Most concerning was the disappearance of Dr. York from the part of the Osage Trail that went through their township. A decision was made. A search warrant was issued for every farmstead in the area between the headwaters of Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. 3 days after the meeting, Billy Toll was driving his cows past the Bender Inn, a combination supply store and inn, and the home of the Bender family. He noticed their farm animals roaming about freely, searching for food. When he went to inform the Benders, he found the inn abandoned. Worried the Benders were the latest victims of whoever was killing travelers in the area, Toll reported the abandoned state of the inn to the township trustee, Leroy F. Dick. A search party was formed, including Dr. York's brother, Colonel A. M. York of Fort Scott. When the search party arrived at the property, they found it empty. No food, clothing, or personal possessions were left. A terrible smell hung inside the wooden structure. While searching for its source, a trapdoor was discovered on the cabin floor. It was nailed shut. The men pried the trapdoor open. They discovered a 6-foot-deep hole, and when they descended into it, they found that the smell was due to a large amount of clotted blood. However, no bodies were found in the hole. Suspicions rose. The men dug up and moved the entire cabin to one side to search beneath it. They found nothing more. They began to dig around the cabin, including in the vegetable garden and orchard. In the orchard, just beneath a patch of recently disturbed soil, they found a body, buried face down with its feet scarcely covered. The corpse was identified as that of Dr. William H. York. His throat had been cut and his skull crushed. Over 2 days of digging, 9 bodies were uncovered, as well as numerous dismembered body parts. Another of Dr. York's brothers, a lawyer and state senator from Independence, offered a $1,000 reward for information about the Benders. Governor Thomas Osborne offered an additional $2,000 for the apprehension of all 4 Benders. Word spread fast, and thousands of people flocked to the site of the Bender Inn. News reporters came from as far away as New York and Chicago, calling the site Hell's Half Acre in their articles. Photographs of the graves, the pit, and the moved cabin were taken. The cabin itself was ripped apart by souvenir hunters. Even the bloody bricks that lined the cellar were taken. A search party followed fresh wagon tracks leading from the Bender cabin to the town of Thayer, some 12 miles north. After asking around, they discovered that people matching the Benders' description had boarded a train. Several days later, the Benders' wagon and horses were found in Thayer, the horses nearly starved. Little by little, information about the Benders was pieced together, some from travelers who had visited the cabin before the discovery, some from neighbors, and some from county records. I'm going to go over the details, some of which may be embellished, but first an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can gain access to ad-free episodes of the Morbid Curiosity podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. In 1870, 5 spiritualist families settled just northeast of what later became the town of Cherryvale. Spiritualists, who believe that humans can contact the spirits of the dead, weren't known in the area at the time, so people had no reason to question them, support them, or debunk them. The Bender family was one of these 5 spiritualist families. After a few months, most of the spiritualists moved away, unwilling to put up with the harsh lifestyle, but the Bender family stayed. The family was made up of John Bender Sr., Ma Bender, John Bender Jr., and Kate Bender. Supposedly a German immigrant, John Bender Sr. was about 60 years old and around 6 feet tall. John had earned the nickname Old Beetle-Browed John because of his heavy-set black eyes and bushy eyebrows. People described him as wild-looking, as he had long hair, a long beard, and often wore a scowl. His accent was so heavy that few could understand him. John Bender Jr. was about 25, tall and slender, with auburn hair and a mustache. Many considered him handsome. He spoke fluent English with a German accent and was said to be very social. However, he often laughed aimlessly, which gave people the impression that perhaps he had some mental differences, a condition which, at the time, was referred to as a half-wit. These two were the first of the Benders to appear in the area. Local land parcel records show that the two settled on the western slopes of the mounds that are now known as the Bender Mounds. John Sr., also known as Pa Bender, chose a parcel of 160 acres. John Jr. chose a long, narrow strip of land just north of Pa Bender's land, sharing one boundary. The Benders bought a load of rocks from a neighbor, including a 7-foot square and 3-inch thick rock slab for their cellar floor. They bought hay from another neighbor for a thatch roof, and lumber from Fort Scott for a 1-room cabin. Working quickly, they built a 16 by 24-foot cabin, a 3-sided stone and sod barn, and a well. Nothing was built on John Jr.'s land. In late 1871, when the cabin was just about finished, the Benders sent for the rest of their family to join them. Ma Bender and her daughter Kate came by train from Ottawa, Canada, 108 miles north of the Bender homestead. Ma Bender was a heavy-set woman who was said to be feared by her husband and son. She wasn't much friendlier to the neighbors. She was so surly that she was described as having sinister eyes, and her neighbors called her she-devil behind her back. Ma Bender claimed to be a medium who could speak with the dead and declared she could cast charms and spells using boiled herbs and roots. Most people avoided her. Kate Bender was the most liked member of the Bender clan. She was described as beautiful, about 23 years old, and easy to talk to. She was quick to laugh and talk to strangers, speaking with just a slight accent. She and her brother John were readily accepted in the community and often attended Sunday school near Harmony Grove, southeast of the Bender cabin. Kate was also a self-proclaimed medium. She gave lectures on spiritualism and conducted seances for people in the area. She soon made a profitable business doing this by distributing circulars that proclaimed her skills, which included healing. It was said that in her lectures she often advocated free love and that murder could sometimes be justified. It soon became obvious that Kate desired fame, wealth, and position. Her actions began to cause the locals to call her a witch behind her back. Once Ma and Kate Bender had arrived, the Benders purchased furniture and supplies. These were loaded into their heavy covered wagon. Once unloaded at the cabin, the canvas cover of the wagon was drawn tightly from wall to wall, forming a partition between the front and back of the cabin. The area at the back became their living and sleeping quarters. A sign was placed on the front of the cabin reading "Groceries." The front of the cabin soon became a grocery store and rest area for passing travelers. The Osage Trail ran from Fort Scott in the northeast through the Osage Mission in what is now St. Paul, and then down through the mounds to Cherryvale, which was 7 miles northeast of the Bender cabin. The road then went on to Independence, Kansas. It was the only road open for travel at the time. Many weary travelers needed provisions and a place to stop for a meal. The Benders' cabin was one of few places to stop along the road. Just north of the cabin, Kate and Ma Bender planted a garden and a row of fruit trees, which would eventually be an orchard. It was constantly being planted and tended. It's thought that perhaps the Benders hoped to sell their crops as well. According to published county records, the Benders operated their store and overnight rest area between the winter of 1871 and the spring of 1873. Unfortunately for those weary travelers, the Benders' cabin wasn't the safe haven it promised to be. Lone male travelers were frequently looking to settle in the area and therefore carried large sums of cash intending to buy stock or purchase a claim. This type of lone male traveler also sometimes went missing without explanation. The area was dangerous after all. Friends and family searching for them could trace their movements as far as the Kansas Big Hill Country before the trail went cold. Several of these missing travelers fell victim to the Benders, who had set up a trap for them. The evidence of their method lay in the setup of the house, as reported by the initial search party. When weary travelers stopped for a meal at the cabin, they were seated at a table with their backs to the large canvas partition. John Jr. would distract them with talk, or Kate perhaps flirted and offered a seance. While their attention was focused elsewhere, Pa Bender, who was hiding behind the canvas, would strike their heads with a hammer through it. The group then searched the body for money, and once they were done, pushed it through the trap door into the cellar. The victim's throat was then cut, the blood spattering where no one could see it. The body would then be buried in the garden behind the house under the cover of darkness. This setup worked well for the Bloody Benders for nearly 3 years. As word of the gruesome murders spread, several travelers came forward with stories of what they now knew to be a narrow escape. William Pickering had stopped at the Benders, and when he saw stains on the canvas sheet, he refused to sit with his back to it. Kate suddenly threatened him with a knife, so he fled the premises. A Catholic priest reported that when he visited, he saw one of the Bender men concealing a large hammer. He left immediately. The beginning of the end of the Benders' killing spree was the murder of the launchers. Dr. York had stopped at every homestead along the trail to ask after the launchers before he himself was killed. Both of Dr. York's 2 brothers knew his travel plans, and when he failed to return home, a well-funded search began for the missing doctor. Colonel York, followed by around 50 men, questioned every traveler and stopped at every homestead along the trail, including the Benders' cabin. The Benders admitted that Dr. York had stopped at their place, but swore he had left it unharmed. Kate attempted to use her clairvoyant powers to locate Dr. York and suggested he had been waylaid by Indians. After the visit from Colonel York and the meeting at Harmony Grove Schoolhouse, the Bender family fled. A few days later, the homestead was found abandoned and the bodies were uncovered. 9 bodies were found in the Benders' apple orchard, including Dr. York, Mr. Launcher, and his daughter. More disturbing was the fact that the girl's body displayed multiple injuries, such as a broken arm, a dislocated knee, and a cracked sternum, none of which caused her death. It was suspected that she had been beaten and then buried alive. Other bodies in the orchard were identified as Harry Mackenzie, Ben Brown, W.F. McCrawdy, and John Geary, as well as an unidentified male and female. The body of a man named Johnny Boyle was found in the well. The dismembered body parts of several other victims couldn't be identified. 4 other bodies were found outside the property in Drum Creek and on the surrounding prairie, bearing signs of the Benders' method of killing: crushed skulls and cut throats. It's estimated that from these 9 proven and many other suspected murders, the Benders gained about $4,600, 2 teams of horses and wagons, a pony and a saddle, all of which were worth between $860 and $1,160. That's a total of between $5,460 and $5,760, which amounts to between $142,000 and $150,000 in today's US dollars. That's not a huge amount of money. The murders were a media sensation, one of the first truly national serial killer stories to spark America's curiosity. Unlike the serial killers who came after them, the Benders worked as a group, and Kate, with her claimed powers and views on free love, became the public face of the crime. The mix of sex and death that Kate came to represent spawned salacious reports in newspapers across the country. What makes this story even more unusual is the fact that the Benders didn't exactly vanish. Eyewitnesses reported seeing the fugitives escape by train. Some claimed to even know where they went: Ma and Pa to Missouri, and Kate and John to Texas. Kate and John were supposedly seen in Denison, Texas, before reuniting with Ma and Pa in Red River Station. From there, the family was said to have moved west into Indian Territory, known to the locals but outside the reach of the authorities. The Benders were never pursued beyond initial efforts. In Indian Territory, they would have surrounded themselves with criminals, including other murderers and thieves seeking refuge beyond the reach of law enforcement. Arresting them would have been a monumental operation, so the Benders stayed at large, despite the nationwide clamor for their capture. In 1889, 2 women were arrested on suspicion of being Ma and Kate Bender. Almira Monroe and her adult daughter Sarah Eliza Davis were accused after being caught shoplifting. However, at the preliminary trial to determine their identities, 7 witnesses brought in to identify them were positive that they were the Benders, and the other 7 were equally positive that they weren't. The remaining 2 witnesses weren't sure. Eventually, their defense lawyers were able to prove that they were not the Benders, and the 2 women were released. Over the years, many people have added to the story with both research and embellishment. Unfortunately, the threads have become entangled and are now a web of rumor and hearsay. According to these rumors, Pa Bender was actually named John Flickinger. He allegedly took his own life in 1884 near Lake Michigan, but some believe that Ma and Kate murdered him for running off with the cash and valuables they'd taken off their victims. Ma Bender was supposedly born in the Adirondacks and named Almira. As a teenager, she married a man named George Griffith. After having several children with Ma, including Kate, Mr. Griffith suddenly died, possibly due to a hammer strike to the head. Afterward, Ma reportedly remarried and killed several husbands, as well as 3 of her children, in order to silence witnesses. John Jr. was supposedly named John Gebhardt. His habit of laughing aimlessly was actually a ruse to disguise his clever nature. Though John and Kate pretended to be brother and sister, they may have been man and wife. The 2 were said to have had a sexual relationship. Supposedly, John died of a stroke in outlaw country along the Texas-New Mexico border. Kate was supposedly the 5th child of Ma and was born Eliza Griffith. She allegedly married and became Sarah Eliza Davis. While working at the Bender Inn, it's rumored that she prostituted herself in addition to her medium work. The old Bender property is also said to be haunted. A decade after the killings, the only thing remaining of what had been the Benders' cabin and grounds was a deep hole that had once been the cellar. From this hole, it's said that the souls of those murdered pour out and wander the property, moaning and wailing. It's also said that the ghost of Kate Bender sometimes returns to the property, roaming the place where she killed so many people. The sensational tales of the Benders continued well into the 20th century. As you can see, the trial of Almira Monroe and Sarah Elizabeth Davis has been woven into the story, not as the misidentification that it was, but as another daring Bender escape from the law. Kate's views on free love turned her into a prostitute, and John Jr.'s strange behavior was turned into a mask used to hide his evil genius. And of course, a tale of murder is nothing without a ghost haunting the scene of the crime. The tale of the Bender family was so popular that the Bender Museum opened in Cherryvale in 1961. An exact replica of the Bender cabin was built to house antiques and household items from the era of the murders. The opening 3 days saw over 2,000 visitors. In 1967, 3 hammers taken from the Bender cabin were gifted to the museum and were a popular exhibit. The museum remained popular until it closed in 1978. While many wanted to relocate the collections, the museum had become controversial in Cherryvale, with locals resenting that the town was primarily known for the murders. In the end, the collection was donated to the Cherryvale Museum, where it can still be seen today. A historical marker telling of the murders has been erected on the high prairie about a mile northwest of the Bender Mounds at the Montgomery County Rest Area, north of Cherryvale. In 2016, a horror film called Bender, directed by John Alexander, was released. It blends fact with fiction and changes some aspects of the story. I found it quite creepy, though it was very much a slow burn. It helps if you already know the story to understand what's going on in the film. The rising dread and then panic against the expansive and empty backdrop of the Kansas prairie was quite striking. In 2020, the land where the Bender home once stood was purchased by Bob Miller of Independence, Kansas. He hopes that with modern equipment, he can pinpoint the original location of the cabin and grounds, and perhaps unravel more of the mysteries surrounding the Benders. An archaeological excavation is planned for May 2024. On the surface, it seems like the American dream. Immigrants with nothing made a life for themselves on the frontier. However, instead of constant confrontations with the indigenous peoples, which are the heart of many frontier tales, the Benders used precision violence against other settlers. They used the settlers' desperation against them, luring them in with the promise of safety. Then they dispatched them, again using the struggles of settling on the prairie to hide their deeds. No one will ever know their reasons or the full extent of what occurred inside the Bender cabin. The truth behind the story of the Bloody Benders is obscured by secrecy, soil, time, and embellishment. Like so many true crimes, the fascination it sparked caused the story to spread like wildfire across a prairie, the smoke of speculation obscuring the facts. Combing through the ashes gives us small glimpses, but will never reveal the whole macabre truth. And that is why the Bloody Benders spark our morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Heather A., Amber C., Matthew D., Marcella, Kylie, LJ, Jaffameister, and Chris F. all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you so much. Thank you as well to the free members of the Patreon page. It's nice to see you there. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.